Hey, seniors. Obviously, I'm doing this on Thursday night, but you're not going to see this till Friday. So happy Friday. You've made it through a week, and I hope that you're not completely frustrated with everything that's going on. I know, hopefully, some of the emotion of things that have been lost at this point, um, that emotion has kind of subsided some. Understand that we are talking uh, about trying to do some type of graduation for you, have some type of ceremony, even if it's later after school might be out. But so please don't give up on us, okay? Um, we hate this for you. Um, I know I don't have a kid in school, I don't have a senior, but my heart goes out to you, and I do love each and every one of you. And really, when I said at the beginning of the year that I really was excited to have you guys as you exit the school, I really meant it. You have been my favorite class to be with, and I say that unashamedly. And Lord willing, we'll get back together and share some donuts and have something vegan for our vegan friend. And I don't say that jokingly, I'm very serious. But I miss you guys. And I just want you to know that we're working hard. I'm working hard. Uh, I'm what they call a Luddite, just an old fashioned person. So all of this technology stuff is new to me. And I have a computer that doesn't even have a working camera or microphone. And so I'm doing all of my videos by my phone. And but the Lord's provided and taken care of us, and I'm glad that I hope that you're safe and that you're doing your best to maintain that social distancing, especially those of you that are couples. And please make sure that you sanitize and wash and do all of those things. Well, listen, here we are at the end of the week, and we've finished our chapter, and we're going to have a test next week. Now, tomorrow, you'll have one more review assignment, and it'll be different than today. And then next week, we're still trying to figure out the best way to administer tests. The good news is that you only have to go until the first part of May, like you would if we had been in school. So you only have a few short weeks. And let me clear some things up here about the technology part on my end. Some of you have been frustrated with some of the work, not the work, but the way that it's been graded. Those are Google documents. And when I type in a question, especially on the multiple choice, Google searches for an answer. And if they find an answer, they give it to me as a suggestion. If they don't, they leave it alone. And so sometimes the ones that they don't have an answer for, they're gonna tell you that you got them wrong or that there's not a correct answer. Just ignore all that. You guys are getting the answers right. The grade that you see is probably not going to be accurate. And so please do me a favor and make sure that you're checking Headmaster every couple of days. And I put some grades in today for you. And that will tell you, that will be the true judge of how you're doing, at least in my class. Okay? So your emails about, it said this is a wrong answer, there were not any correct answers, you can stop those. Now, if you just want to tell me hi and that you love me and you're praying for me, I appreciate that because I do pray for you. I still pray for you by name at least once a week. If you do have a need, you can email me or, if you have a legitimate question. But so what we're going to do today is I'm going to teach, and you're going to need to watch this video through because the questions are not going to come from your book necessarily, as much as from my video. And so there'll be some things that I'll say in the video. It may not have anything to do with history, but I might just make it a question. So please watch me all the way through. I promise not to be long. I've made a couple already. One of them went 37 minutes, but yours isn't. But I just want to finish out this chapter. Your test will not be over the whole chapter. If you remember, we've already had a test over the first part of the chapter. And so we're going to start with, in the section, it's going to be, if you want to look in your book, it's in the section Isolation and Infamy. And we're going to begin with the fall of the Philippines. And the United States, remember, had appointed Douglas MacArthur as the head of all of the troops in the Far East. And he was in the Philippine Islands with U.S. troops, and the Philippine troops and the U.S. troops were forced out. And Douglas MacArthur famously is quoted as having said, "I shall return," which he did about 10 years later to the Philippines, and helped them to win a battle to gain their freedom. But in leaving the Philippines, they left a bunch of troops there. They were not able to get off the islands, and those troops were forced into what became known as the Bataan Death March. And of the 78,000 troops that remained there, about 10,000 of them died on that journey. Kind of like in our country, back in the 1800s, the Trail of Tears that the Cherokee Indians were forced on. So one of the first strikes against the Japanese military was led by Jimmy Doolittle, and he was instrumental in a bombing raid on Tokyo. Landing in China wasn't going to work, but we were able to surprise the Japanese, and that bombing raid was successful. Then we come to the Battle of Midway. We know that the Coral Sea was very important, and the Japanese were headed towards Australia to try to take it. And the Battle of Midway, kind of like the Battle of Gettysburg and other battles throughout the course of world history, the Battle of Midway was kind of a major turning point in the war. And one of the reasons it was is because the United States had broken the Japanese radio codes. It was during this period of time, if my history tells me correctly, and I'm just going from the hip here, that we had the Navajo code breakers or talkers, and that could interpret the Japanese code. And so the Navajo Indians, as you saw in your work on Wednesday, were very instrumental. They were one of those three minority groups, the Nisei, the Navajo, and the African Americans. And the Navajo were very good, were able to do that for us. And so the Battle of Midway was very instrumental in the war. Here in the States, we were making preparation. Remember, we haven't entered the war. There were three things that kept us from entering the war. Do you remember them? Our policy of isolation, our concern about the existing war debt, and we were going through the Great Depression. And so even though we didn't jump right in, the president saw the need to begin to make preparation. So one of the things that he did was create the War Production Board. And remember, the War Production Board was created to help transition manufacturing from domestic goods to military goods, whether it be weapons or modes of transportation. And so it was during this period of time that Americans got their rationing books, where they were only able to buy certain items based on the coupon that they had. And we got real big into the recycling of old oil and scrap metal because those were used in the war effort. We also created some women's branches of the military. We had the WACS, the Women's Army Corps, and we had the WAVES, which was a branch of the Navy. There were the WASPs, which were the Air Force. And they were instrumental in just being kind of like ground support and support here in the United States while soldiers were being deployed to theaters across the Atlantic. It was also during this time that many housewives had to join the workforce because their husbands were gone and to fight in the war. Well, as we talk about the war itself, the war in Europe began to develop in many different areas. In Italy, you had Mussolini, who tried to annex, which means to try to incorporate with something else. He tried to annex some territory in North Africa. You had the German general Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, and his panzers or tanks. And he arrived with his Africa Corps to help take over parts of North Africa. You had, at this time, you had the meeting in Casablanca, and that was a question that you had as well with Roosevelt, Churchill, and Charles de Gaulle. And they developed an allied strategy to invade Europe. And so their first step was to invade Italy, because Italy was a little bit more vulnerable than the rest of Europe. And so they invaded the island of Sicily and eventually went up the peninsula, and Italy eventually surrendered to the Allied forces. And the Germans, however, still declared that Mussolini was the leader of Italy. The fight for Italy was very costly, however. We continue on, and you have the events of D-Day. Eisenhower was declared the supreme Allied commander, and he was the leader of what was known as Operation Overlord, which began on June 6, 1944, along the Normandy coast of France. And that was a big success, the invasion of Normandy. So by the end of 1944, France, Holland, the little country of Luxembourg, and Belgium had been freed from the Germans. It's interesting, as I'm doing this video, my wife is talking to her mother in Illinois, and her mother is from Belgium. She immigrated here, a number of years ago. It's probably been over 40 years. And my wife's grandfather, her mother's dad, Grandpa Cy, he was an interesting character. He lied on his application to join the military in Belgium and joined at, I think, 15 years of age when he had to be 16 because he wanted to fight on the side of the United States. And he eventually immigrated here to the United States and worked most of his life for John Deere, and retired, passed away a few years ago, but spoke very few words of English. And one of his favorite things to do was to go to the horse races. And he'd take my wife when we'd go visit, and he always called me the priest. He knew I was an ordained minister. He was Catholic by religion, and every time I'd go see him, he'd offer me a little bit of wine, and he'd say, "Oh, my priest drink it," and I'd say, "No, Si, I'm not going to do it." And he passed away. Could hardly understand him, but I'd sit and listen to him. He loved Philip, my son. Sent him when he passed away, Si's second wife sent Philip some medals that he had earned during his time in the Belgian army. So anyhow, that's just a little bit about what's happened. Then we come to the Battle of the Bulge. And it's called the Battle of the Bulge, as you saw in your assignment, because the great offensive caused a bulge or a bend in the lines. And it began on December 16th, 1944. That date is not so much important, but you had General Montgomery and General Patton who were able to push the Germans back and get them back on the other side of the line. The Pacific War was a two-pronged attack. It would be an attempt to reclaim the Philippines and then an invasion of the Japanese islands. And at the time, we didn't have the technology to fly from one continent to the other, so we were dependent on a process called island hopping. And so what we began to do was we began to take from the Japanese islands along the way from the United States to Japan, which would give us places where we could land our aircraft and refuel and even reload with bombs. And we captured the Western Aleutian Islands, and you can look at a map, and the Marshall Islands. If you've ever watched Disney's The Rescuers, when the rescuers, in the Rescuers Down Under, where they have to go to Australia, you'll see that they get on a plane and they go to these islands between here and Australia. And so that's what we did. We took these islands, which gave us the opportunity to put our aircraft down and refuel and reload. And so we got involved in a very massive air battle over the Marianas, and it became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And if you've ever been to a turkey shoot, you know basically all you're doing is firing at a piece of wood and trying to get as close to the X as you can. And maybe you win a turkey or whatever the prizes are. And basically it's a game of luck, and that's what the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was. We were just kind of going all out and hoping for the best. And we fought the Battle of the Leyte Gulf, as you saw. And the Leyte Gulf, Battle of the Leyte Gulf, was the largest naval battle in history. And we're not sure exactly how many ships were involved, but it was a very substantial American victory. Even though the Japanese tried to employ, as they did at Pearl Harbor, their kamikaze pilots, we were able to come away with a considerable victory. The Battle of Iwo Jima, and you guys went to the Iwo Jima Memorial on your junior trip, and that's a memory that you should hold. But the Battle of Iwo Jima was the costliest marine battle in our history. But even though we, and I guess you could refer to it as a Pyrrhic victory, we won, but at great cost, and the Japanese resistance was crushed on Iwo Jima. Then we moved on to Okinawa, and Okinawa is a main island today in the Japanese chain of islands, and it became the bloodiest single battle in the Pacific theater. Lasted about 2.5 months. Many civilians died, and it was just an indication of how difficult it was going to be to defeat the Japanese and how entrenched they were in their own islands. And so as the war continued and victory seemed to be on the horizon, some of the leaders, both of the Allies and the Axis, met at what is called the Yalta Conference. The three figures at that conference were Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, and they began to make preparations for Europe post-war. And Roosevelt had just become president. He had just won another term. His vice president for that term was Harry Truman. And Roosevelt felt that he could work with Joseph Stalin. But even with that positivity, Stalin was not a person who was one to keep his word. And he promised to join the war against Japan after Germany was defeated. But Germany and Berlin were eventually divided into 4 zones. Roosevelt died 8 weeks after leaving Yalta, and Truman became president. So Truman finished out the war. And so we come to VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. It came about after several things transpired. Mussolini was captured and shot. Hitler committed suicide, unless you're one of those conspiracy theorist kind of people, and he might be alive somewhere, or his body is cryogenically preserved, or whatever. The Nazis surrendered. And so in Europe, they celebrate VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. They went to the Potsdam Conference, where Truman and Clement Attlee and Stalin met and tried to come to some agreements.